to turn your cameras off. Well, welcome everybody. I am just so pleased to see so many folks here tonight. My name is Sarah Dooling. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and I am thrilled to have pulled together in collaboration with many community advocates this urgently needed conversation on local leadership for better buildings in Massachusetts. So as I have shared with folks coming into the room, you've been muted upon entry. I do invite folks to share your name and the town from which you're calling in from into the chat. If you can drop your name and town into the chat. Obviously, we are recording this webinar. We started 6:35, and I will be sending out the link to the recording, the slides, and the resources that I will go over at the very end for taking action. I just want to share briefly with folks that are less familiar or not familiar with Mass Climate Action Network. We were founded in 2000. We provide a network of connections with municipal-based advocates, as well as state decision makers, as well as expertise, but we really focus on municipal level action and empowering folks at the local level to take leadership like the folks that you will hear from tonight are doing. And our theory of change is all about what starts at the local level can influence in a positive way what can happen at the state and national levels. So tonight, I am just so pleased to present our lineup of speakers. Even though they are presented in alphabetical order by town in the graphic, we will be starting off by hearing from Jessie Gray, co-founder along with Lisa Cunningham in Brookline of the Zero Carbon Mass group. And Jessie is the chair of Brookline's Zero Emissions Advisory Board. And so we're going to hear some really interesting history and future strategies around Brookline's attempts to prohibit fossil fuel hookups in new construction. Following Jessie, we are going to hear about what is happening in Lexington, some really interesting approaches to dealing with the largest emitter in their building stock, these lab spaces. And Cindy Ahrens, she is a representative of the Clean Heat Lexington Alliance, and she will be sharing a lot of what Lexington is focusing on. And Lexington has been incredibly busy. Wrapping up our community advocacy presenters is Ann Wright, a beloved colleague who is part of the Mass Building Electrification Accelerator team, as well as a campaign coordinator with Mothers Out Front representing Arlington. And Ann's contribution tonight is really emphasizing how to build a movement within your municipality, how to strategize, and that is equally important to thinking about the actual tools that you want to affect change with. Closing us out, I'm really thrilled to have Ellen Watts provide some final comments and remarks. And Ellen is an architect, LEED certified principal and co-founder of the firm Architera. She is also a board member of AIA Mass, American Institute of Architects, and she is graciously agreed to give some closing remarks this evening. So we look forward to that. I do want to just do a brief overview of the agenda. Presenters have 10 to 12 minutes each, so we're really talking about formal presentation and Ellen's closing remarks taking about 35 minutes, and I want to leave ample time for Q&A. I see this particular conversation as a first step for many different reasons. One of the reasons being, the state's straw proposal for what is called the specialized stretch code, which was released early last month. Comments, are due. The deadline for dropping in comments is on Friday, March 18th. And I'll go over a little bit more of that towards the end. But for those of you that have been involved in that process, one of the reasons why the home rule petitions and local leadership is so important is that the state is not exercising maximum leadership in making sure that we can build fossil-free all-electric buildings going forward. So ample time for Q&A. Follow that up with some actions and resources that MCAN and some of our partner organizations and coalition spaces can provide you going forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to give the microphone over to Jesse Gray. Go, Jesse.
Thank you. Thank you, MCAN, for hosting. Thank you, Sarah. By now, you know there is nobody who has this climate situation under control. Nobody at the top in charge doing what needs to be done. There are no adults in the room. By now you know this, and it's really not different than it's always been. After all, change doesn't start with the Supreme Court. It doesn't start with the Congress or the White House or the State House. It starts at a whites-only lunch counter with a polite refusal to leave. It starts with a mayor in San Francisco marrying 2 men. And we're starting to realize it started in Berkeley, California, in 2019 with a gas ban. 2019 was when banning gas in new buildings began in Berkeley and started to spread. San Jose, Santa Barbara, Sacramento, 60 cities throughout California. Gas bans, I gotta be clear, do not ban gas combustion or even prevent a new boiler from being installed. They merely prevent major construction projects from installing unnecessary, brand new fossil fuel infrastructure. Gas bans here would protect you as a property owner, renter, from builders and landlords who are otherwise wasting your time and money by putting in new fossil systems that we actually need to be taking out so we can meet our climate goals. By now, you know gas bans are a practical step and a fiscally conservative step. Gas bans are by far the least expensive way to get started course correcting building emissions, because it's easiest to do the right thing when you're doing major construction anyway. And for those who don't know, buildings are an enormous piece of our emissions. 2019 was also when, in Brookline, we copied Berkeley, and we took it further despite our colder seasons. We banned fossil fuel systems not only in new construction, but also in gut rehabs. We also added exemptions and a waiver process to ensure that it was practical. And with these exceptions aside, there is no reason to install a gas system during major construction. Our emissions budget doesn't have an allowance for installation of new sources of emissions. That's why the gas ban is so important. It's an example of starting with what is needed to solve a problem instead of starting with what is politically feasible at the moment. We need to stop creating new fossil fuel infrastructure, and we need to stop creating new demand for methane gas, which is locking us into decades of planetary warming. It's not really a choice. By now you know that our first Brookline gas ban from 2019 was struck down during legal review by the Massachusetts Attorney General. We had run afoul of competing priorities enshrined in legacy laws. These legacy laws include a purported right for utilities to sell methane gas and a purported right for builders to have supposedly uniform building codes. These legacy laws fail to meet this moment, and indeed, they conflict with newer state law that mandates emissions reductions. But they were enough for the Attorney General to disallow our gas ban. Gas bans are the beginning of the end for fossil fuels. This matters enough to the fossil fuel industry that 20 states have recently preempted gas bans with new state law. Here, with a series of decisions from our own Attorney General, we are now effectively one of those states. You have to push through this kind of resistance to take progress to the next level. In 2019, we normalized gas bans, taking them out of the category of policies people know are needed but despair of getting done, and into the category where the legislature, overcoming a gubernatorial veto, asked for a stretch code to do it, and where the Attorney General asked the Department of Public Utilities to state their plan to do it in the 2080 process. Because of the path that we are paving, New York City, not subject to Massachusetts law, actually enacted a real gas ban. With your help, we have begun to move the political needle. By the time our 2019 bylaw was struck down, we had sparked a building electrification movement in Massachusetts that includes many of you here tonight. Then, together with Lexington, Arlington, Acton, Concord, and Cambridge, and soon to be more cities and towns, we passed so-called home rule petitions that are now being used by the legislature as leverage to compel the administration to produce a real net zero stretch code. In the meantime, in Brookline, we also sought a way to achieve much of the goal of the original gas ban by passing last year zoning incentives to discourage the installation of new gas infrastructure during major construction. And we specifically and carefully crafted these zoning incentives to follow the specific guidance of the Attorney General from her first disallowal. When she had shut the door on an outright ban, she had at that time left the door open to incentives to achieve the same goal. And these incentives we thought would be in line with those that she has routinely approved, including incentives in Lexington for all electric HVAC systems and in Arlington for building efficiency standards. However, despite her prior guidance, 3 weeks ago, the Attorney General disallowed our incentive bylaws for allegedly being in conflict with state law. This new decision is a smackdown. It leaves no doubt that we as municipalities are not only banned from banning gas, we are not only banned from taking the next most essential step for the Commonwealth to meet its own legally binding emission standards. We aren't even allowed to incentivize builders to voluntarily do it. To the state leaders who think they're the adults in the room, let municipalities lead. The state has a great goal to decarbonize 1 million buildings in the next 8 years, but there's no plan to make it happen, none. Instead, we are building new buildings every day with gas systems that will need to be replaced well before their useful lives are up. Instead of proposing real solutions, the administration has pointedly declined to fulfill their legislative requirement to promulgate a real net zero stretch code. It is time to let municipalities lead. Meanwhile, Maura Healey, running for governor, has intimated that she's not a fan of municipal gas bans and has said that there should be a more holistic solution at the state or even regional level. And this is a great goal, but what it ignores is the fierce urgency of now. A more holistic solution, even if there is one that's politically viable, would unfortunately take a lot more time, and time is not on our side. Every new gas building is a new expensive problem. That's why it's time to let municipalities lead. It's a simple truth that the Commonwealth cannot meet its legally binding 2030 emissions targets without the gas bans. The barriers being put up by the state, including the DPU, the DOER, the governor, the attorney general, and the legislature, also point to a problem. The problem is that the will to address climate is strongest at the local level, in places like your cities and towns. But the authority resides at the state level. This unfortunate mismatch of political will and authority is one of the biggest barriers to the kind of acceleration of climate progress that we need. It's why we have to let municipalities lead. It's also why we got to give props to Berkeley City Councilor Kate Harrison, an affordable housing advocate who introduced the first gas ban in the United States. It is not an accident that Kate is an affordable housing advocate. Nothing is less equitable than stranding our most vulnerable citizens on methane gas islands, leaving them to pick up the tab as gas prices rise while rich people disconnect from the gas grid, as is already happening. But stranding our most vulnerable citizens with gas is exactly what many developers are doing out of laziness and ignorance. Those who say gas bans aren't equitable don't understand what's already happening here. Berkeley City Councilor Kate Harrison's clauses can be found verbatim in our 2019, 2020, and 2021 gas bans passed overwhelmingly by Brookline Town Meeting. Her clauses are alive in the legislature right now in the Guivea-Eldridge bill, the Khan bill, and in all of our home rule petitions. Passing this legislation would enable any municipality in the state to stop the wasteful installation of new fossil fuel infrastructure in major construction. But unfortunately, there is absolutely no commitment in the legislature to passing any of this. The powers that be are clinging to the old order. They are clinging to instruments like the building codes, which at least right now, in areas like building electrification and EV charging, have become a tool for the fossil industrial complex to preempt progress, more a barrier than a solution. Progress is not fast enough or certain enough, and that's why we need your help. We need you to do three things. One, call your state rep and your state senator and urge them to pass this legislation. Second, take a step yourself in your own life toward making sure you or your family or your landlord have already bought your last gas appliance or car. Get an electrician over, make sure there's enough power, put an electrical circuit in place. This way, when your next gas appliance dies, you'll be able to replace it on the same day with an electric one. This kind of personal infrastructure planning will ground you. Then the third thing is, we need you to pass a gas ban home rule petition. Pass a home rule petition asking the legislature for permission for your town or city to ban installation of new fossil fuel infrastructure in major construction. Pass it this fall so that it'll be live at the beginning of the next legislative session. Pass it in your hometown because nothing will speak louder. Show them that it's not just Brookline and Arlington and Lexington. Show them that it's Boston, and show them that it's Boxford and Gloucester and Worcester. Show them that it's Salem and Quincy and Framingham and the Berkshires. Show them by passing a home rule petition for a gas ban. It is starting to work. Our local action has started to spur state action. State action will spur federal action. It's how we got civil rights. It's how we got gay marriage, and it is how we are going to solve this problem too. By now, you should know, let's be real. Change doesn't start on Beacon Hill. It has to start with us. And that includes those of us here in this space right now. It includes you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for that resounding presentation. That was incredible. Next up is Cindy Ahrens from Lexington. And Cindy, I am going to pass you the microphone.
Thank you so much. Wow, what I have to follow that. Jesse, thank you very much. Sarah and MCAN, thank you for having me here tonight. I'm honored to be here alongside Ellen and Ann and Jesse. So my name's Cindy Ahrens. I'm from Lexington. I'm just going to get right to it. I got a bunch of slides. I get really excited and sometimes I talk too fast. But here we go. We had a problem in Lexington. Probably not just in Lexington, but we wanted to attract a large life science biotech commercial development in town. We changed some of our commercial zoning to draw it here. That was great for the town, increased property tax revenue, but significantly increased emissions. These are very energy intense buildings, life science buildings. And we know, as Jesse already mentioned, I mean, my bullet point here goes very easy on the situation, but we knew that we didn't have a building code that could do anything about those emissions. And we had passed what we in Lexington call our Clean Heat Home Rule petition, hadn't passed the legislature yet, and exempted these life science buildings anyway. So the solution, and I put in quotes, the word solution in quotes because we've got to do more than this. But we needed a mechanism to drastically lower those emissions. And from what we had seen, some connections that we had, what we were seeing happening in Cambridge and Boston for life science buildings, we had this, it was great. Hybrid HVAC, it's kind of like your car, right? If you have a hybrid vehicle, it can run electric, but also on gas. It was a great great new development for, and not so new actually, for life science buildings. And then we needed a vehicle for that enforcement. And as Jesse mentioned, we had this idea of incentive zoning. We thought we could do this. So the incentive in our commercial zone here was buildings over 65 feet have to use hybrid HVAC. I'll get to what hybrid HVAC is in a little bit more detail later. We had already had some approval of some incentive type zoning for LEED and for all electric for other types of buildings over a certain height in this same commercial zone earlier. So this is how we went forward. So the next few set of slides are the actual slides that we used when we were talking about, when we were shopping this around and talking to town meeting members and to the select board and, and stuff like that. We had, so as I mentioned, great buildings going up in Boston and in Cambridge, beautiful buildings that were going to be life science buildings and had some really, really special things about them. And I'll get to that in a minute. So I mentioned life science buildings, really, really lots of energy use. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but this graph says a lot. On the left there is Lexington's total emissions from cars, from buildings, both commercial and residential, and from food. Actually, that's a whole nother Zoom webinar. But if you look at, so the next, the bar to the right is CM. CM was our commercial manufacturing district. So that's the district. So that's that was our estimate of what the buildings in that district. Some of them were already life science buildings, but smaller buildings. And this was our projection if we had a 3x growth. That's what was being projected in this commercial district, going with conventionally built labs. But if we had these hybrid labs, we could, the fourth graph over, we could significantly, you see, reduce the emissions that would come from a growth, great for our town, great for, property taxes, great for business development, but really have a better, a much more muted effect, if you will, with our emissions. And then imagine that if you if you made sure that all of that electricity was 100% renewable, we could grow our commercial properties in Lexington by 3 times and reduce the amount of emissions that come from them. I mean, that's like amazing stuff. Why, we should be all over that, right? So again, just a little more detail about what these other buildings were doing. So what's hybrid HVAC? It's basically saying, look, for most of the time of the year, for most of the shoulder seasons, they say, that you don't need as much heating. Use, heat pumps. Use all electric heating, high efficient heating systems first. And then once you fulfill that minimum, you can burn fossil fuels afterwards. And what that ends up doing is sort of your coldest days of the year, yeah, that's when you're firing up the gas boilers, but you can use your exhaust source heat pumps, your ground source heat pumps, your air source heat pumps for that first bit of heating that you need. It's happening, like I said, it's happening at these levels, 18 BTUs per hour per square foot. I've learned to say that so quickly now. 15 BTUs per hour per square foot, 5.7 BTUs per hour per square foot. The Binney Street, the building in the middle there, Moderna leased it from Alexandria Development and noted the reason why they picked that building was that it was designed to be the most sustainable commercial lab building in Cambridge. I mean, so the other piece there is like this is what great life science tenants want. And as I mentioned, they can deliver huge emissions reductions and also reduce life cycle costs. So here's the why 5 BTUs per hour per square foot. And so there's a little graph showing you, okay, here's what you do with your clean heat, your non-fossil fuel heat on your, most, shouldered lays can handle that much heating load. And then once you, on the coldest days, you go to fossil fuel. that it's not, we didn't pull it out of the air. We got it from, there was a proposal, and some of you on this call may have been involved in this proposal, but way back even to May of 2020, and maybe even earlier than that, a group of numerous regional and national code professionals, design firms, professionals said, yes, we can do 5 BTUs per hour per square foot, any kind of, with high efficiency electric heating for all kinds of buildings, even lab buildings. So this is something that's clearly can be done. And then, as I mentioned, as you saw on the previous slide, there were a bunch of buildings that were either in design or under construction that were exceeding that limit. RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, was very supportive of this, and put out a letter and said, this makes sense. What they're doing makes sense. So what are we talking about here? Best practice. It's happening. It's lower emissions, healthier, more economic, more responsible, and gives a measurable standard. This is sort of, instead of asking developers, well, can you do better? No, it's saying you have to do at least this. And at the time, we thought, this is not preempted by state building code because it was a zoning incentive, being that that the buildings taller than 65 feet had to do that. So what did we do? We did a lot. We talked to all of those major property owners. We, talked to town council, talked to our own state delegation, to town staff, building commissioner, planning board. We talked to all sorts of people. We put a website together. We outreached to individual town meeting members, had webinars like this, Q&A sessions, and what happened? Overwhelmingly, we passed it at a town meeting 170-4. I mean, if that's not clearly, if that doesn't show what our town wants, I don't know what does. And what happened after that? A completely overwhelming positive response. We had developers that had already put in some plans, that had plans for developing life science in that area, in that commercial district, and we started talking to them, and they said, oh yeah, we can meet that. We even think that we're going to exceed that. We think it's going to be easy. And why were they doing that? Because they know that that's what their tenants want. You see more and more articles, New York Times, wherever, that property development investors are requiring this. They're noticing that this is for the long term. We don't want to be stranded on fossil fuels. Like they realize that this is the smart way to go, that this is the right way to go, and a sound investment. And so that's my slides. I guess I went through them really quickly. I'm really happy to stay for Q&A, and I will just say, because as Jesse alluded to, I first gave this presentation back in January. We have since learned that the Attorney General has postponed their deadline. They would have had to give their decision on this zoning article just in the last week, and they've postponed it down to June. So we will have to wait and see. But we really do feel like it was a great win, a great sort of outreaching, get everybody talking and realizing that this is happening. It can be done. That investors are seeing this and know that this is the direction we should be going. And I think that it will work. So happy to answer some questions later.
Fabulous, Cindy. Thank you so much. Again, another incredibly inspirational set of comments about how local leadership is happening and being effective right now. Our next presenter is Ann Wright from Arlington, a Mothers Out Front campaign coordinator. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen since I have Ann's slides. And Ann, I give you the mic.
Thank you. There's my first slide. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah and MCAN, for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm really honored to be here among you all. I'm going to share some real nitty-gritty details about how we passed our fossil fuel hookup restriction in Arlington. But I want to start with just 2 minutes of macro level comments, some of which have been spoken or alluded to by Jesse and Cindy. So here's some initial presumptions that I have about the importance of this local organizing and why we put all this energy into this. As Jesse noted, we are fighting a many-headed profit-making industry that will not voluntarily sign its own death warrant. The people power is needed to force them to change their business model. I'm borrowing this lovely slide here from my friends at Mothers Out Front because it illustrates this so well. We need power to overcome their money power and legal power. Again, as Jesse said as well, that social justice movements have been fueled by people power and have made changes this big in the past against all odds. So I think we can do this, but we're not big enough yet. And this is a sobering note. We are not big enough yet, and we need a lot more regular people understanding and pitching in. Some of you may have heard of Erica Chenoweth, a professor at Harvard and specialist in civil resistance studies. She says that it takes around 3.5% of the population actively participating in protest to ensure serious political change. She studied this a lot. So if you believe her well-researched article or belief, we will need about 243,600 people, 3.5% of the population of Massachusetts, to be actively behind us to make this change in Massachusetts. And we are not there yet. So that's my spiel to explain why such labor-intensive work at the municipal level is worth it and in fact necessary. Mothers Out Front has a great theory of change, and to refer to it again, it taught me that we organizers should spend about half our time working on our impact goals, but the other half working on capacity building goals, and that's to build up that people power. We need to go beyond the already convinced, and then we can bring the pressure to bear on the legislature and get more people to actively protest their false solutions. So that's my spiel. Next slide, please, Sarah. So to get to the nitty gritty, what did we do in Arlington to win an almost unanimous vote to restrict fossil fuel hookups in new construction and major renovations? Here are the first 2 major steps. First, do your initial research on what restrictions would do in town, so you really have the facts behind you. How many buildings would it affect? What your emissions are now in town? They differ from town to town and city to city throughout Massachusetts. And if you enact this ordinance, what it would decrease to, the cost of homes currently, and what would a house cost if it would be electrified? What houses are already electrified? How much of your town's electricity already relies on fossil fuels? We have a community choice aggregation in our town, and some of yours may too. Second major step, and I'm going through this real fast. This is all a big process. It took us maybe 5 months to really build up to this. Identify your targets and timelines for reaching them. Who are the decision makers? Who is the most important to influence, and who might turn out your opposition? Next slide, please. The one before that, the establish your primary and secondary targets. Thanks. So in Arlington, we needed the majority of votes in a 240 or so person town meeting with 21 precincts. So they were the bottom line, and you'd need to analyze that for your city or town. Everybody's different. Of course, then we needed to reach the key people in town that could influence these town meeting members. so that they wouldn't be influenced by false messages or lack of facts or their own fears. Those are called secondary targets. So the town meeting members are the primary targets. Secondary targets are the ones that could influence them. And we thought they were the select board, our town manager, zoning board, chamber of commerce, realtors, the building inspector's office, and the Office of Community Development. And then, of course, making a timeline so that you get ahead of things, deadlines you need to meet. When was the select board going to meet? And so when do we file for them to ask them to give us a recommendation on this? What were the town meeting dates? When were the new town meeting members elected so we could know when these new people were coming in to make sure we educate them? Of course, your targets will be different. It's really worth a meeting or two to figure this out. Get people to who know different parts of the town and different stakeholders to advise you. Nobody knows everything. Next slide, please, Sarah. So these are the remaining steps. You want to create your message, try to find a catchy name that wouldn't turn people off. This is a really key thing in any social justice organizing. Think of the Black Lives Matter slogan, something that really will make people think and have a good identification. So you have a good identification with that good message, and there won't be people that will draw people in. Of course, develop your educationals, your fact sheets. We had a 101, we had a 201. We got economically minded people to help us develop the financial arguments fact sheet, environmental fact sheet, and of course your website. That's sort of de rigueur these days. You've got to have a good website. So create your messaging and your educationals. Fourth, probably most important, build your team and have them, they're the power that will help execute your education and outreach. Get a communications team probably to create those flyers and the website. Core to ours was we had a precinct captain for every one of our 21 precincts. And in some places we had two when we weren't sure we could rely on the one. And they ensured really thorough distribution of our materials to every single town meeting member, because again, they are the ones that we knew would deliver the votes. We had the precinct captains record their responses when we sort of contact them and said, here's this warrant article, what do you think about it? So that we knew where there might be opposition coming in. And then we did special outreach to those secondary targets that I talked about a minute ago. Finally, really quickly, we did really thorough prep for our town meeting. You have limited time you can speak, and you want to make sure you address the issue from various points of view. And we did that. We had a fathers out front, really moving speech, and more environmental and technical to address the technical aspects of it. And so that's a big push. And then the media work as you're preparing for the vote and as you're doing education, and prepare your press release if you're anticipating a win so that you can go right to the press. Next slide. Good, seems like a minute left. Oh, you know what I didn't mention is I don't know where I missed this, but we had 2 public information sessions, and this was right before COVID. I get so happy thinking about this. We had an in-person meeting with maybe 75 people in our town hall, where we had experts speak for about an hour and then Q&A for another hour. And that was really important too. So, again, this is only a very skeleton overview of a detailed campaign. I have so many documents and timelines and other resources that I'd be happy to share with you if you are thinking about undertaking a similar local effort. Please don't reinvent the wheel unless you can. Of course, you might be able to improve on what we did. And my final advice is not to underestimate the number of foot soldiers you'll need or want to pull this off. the work really balloons at the end as you're trying to reach all the precincts and their precinct meetings and, you know, media approaching you and getting ready for that crucial final vote. So that's something I've noticed in various campaigns I've worked on. So you'll really want to sort of staff up, as it were. But, you know, this circles back to some of my initial points about this being an exercise in building broad people power. These type of local actions are so powerful because they force us to reach beyond our already convinced circles, to dare to talk to people who might not agree with us, or to work with people who aren't quite active yet, but do care passionately. Give them an opportunity to climb up what Mothers Out Front calls the ladder of engagement. They are looking for things to do. People are as worried as you are, and that's critical. It's worth it, and I think we've seen in the case of the home rule petitions that this power really does build up and allows the power of the people to be felt as these proceed to the legislature as bills. That's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Anne. Another inspirational and very complimentary presentation on strategy, tactics, and building a movement at the local level, which in many ways, that's what we all are doing. And so a big shout out to Anne for sharing her experiences from Arlington. With that, I am going to pass the microphone to Ellen to give some closing remarks on what we have heard so far this evening. So Ellen, I give you the microphone.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Jesse, Cindy, and Anne. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I always learn so much more than I give, but for what it's worth, I'm Ellen Watts. I live in the town of Wellesley. I'm an architect, and I am strongly in favor of home rule petitions. And yet I only recently converted to this point of view. As an architect, I've designed net zero buildings, practical, affordable, healthy buildings that cost just the same to build as conventional ones, and yet cost less to operate and don't pollute, and are therefore very advantageous to all communities, particularly those that are energy burdened, need more affordable housing, or are environmental justice or gateway communities. I have long believed as an architect that the opt-in net zero stretch energy code, as expressly required by the climate bill, was absolutely for sure the best way to decarbonize the built environment. Why? Because codes offer uniformity, they're enforceable by building inspectors who are state trained. There are also periodic updates on a 3-year cycle nationally. Yet, even if the net zero stretch code were optimal today, and we're far from it, and promulgated by DOER on time by the end of this year, 2022, its adoption would rely on 351 individual city council or town meeting votes. It's just really hard for me to imagine this happening short of 2030, even if Anne Wright herself organized it. So according to the latest IPCC report, we do not have a decade to lose. So home rule petitions, I am now convinced, will help build an even bigger pipeline, while many of us work like crazy to try to reform the building energy code. They are not mutually exclusive. Think about it this way. Home rule petitions are hammers to lower emissions fast. Through self-governance, municipalities can seek to mandate fossil-free new construction and major renovations, which will significantly improve energy performance for current projects and tie them to an electric grid that is transitioning to renewables. It will blunt but not eliminate new emissions. Really good and important idea. The Attorney General has said no to incentive zoning for fossil-free construction, but the legislature would have a really hard time saying no to dozens of home rule petitions without another answer, like pressure to produce a better net zero code or some other legislative action or all of the above. the grown-ups in the room are going to need to do something. By contrast to the hammer of a home rule petition, net zero building codes are a Swiss Army knife to level emissions completely. Building energy codes are dense, detailed, boring performance requirements for every building type, height, size, potentially prescribing energy efficiency, envelope testing, glazing limits, energy use intensity, thermal demand intensity, embodied carbon analysis, commissioning, refrigerants, renewable energy, things home rule petitions will not touch. But if applied, such a net zero stretch code has the potential to level emissions of new construction and reduce emissions from existing buildings as they are retrofit. One final slide to share with all of you proves this point. Let me see if I can do that. Can you all see my screen? All right. This slide shows the challenge and the solution. Here we are on the left, this red dot. We have 8 years to get to the red dot on the right. That is to reduce by 50% building sector emissions. Stepping upward is the significant projected growth this decade under various stretch code options. Only a true net zero stretch code will level emissions as shown by the horizontal green line. And then only retrofitting 100,000 buildings a year statewide will reduce building sector emissions to meet the 2030 goal that's shown by the stepping downward blue boxes. If you haven't already read it and gleaned it for yourselves, the DOR's stretch code straw proposal for the net zero energy code is quite disappointing. It does not meet the 2030 goal, not even close. And it also fails to conform to the Massachusetts Net Zero Building Coalition's stretch code framework, independently scored F on 9 out of 12 criteria. So what should we do? 3 things I leave you with in closing. Sign the Massachusetts Net Zero Building Coalition sign-on letter, and also MCAN's sign-on letter, and anybody else's sign-on letter you can, and tell DOER by Friday to go back to the drawing board and produce a true net zero code this year. We need to have this green line. Secondly, file home rule petitions en masse. I'm sounding like the new convert that I am here. And lastly, use every opportunity to testify for fossil fuel legislation of any number, House or Senate. I just learned this morning about H4477, electrification of new construction and substantial renovations. There are new bills every month, it seems. I've started to become habituated to being a letter writer. I hope you will too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellen. That was fantastic. I'm going to unpin you. Perfect. So thanks to Jesse, thanks to Cindy and Anne and Ellen. And I just want to give some additional closing remarks around taking action. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those slides, but they do include, for example, a link to the MCAN's advocates letter that Ellen mentioned. So the Stretch Code Coalition's letter that Lisa, thank you for dropping a link to that into the chat. If you're affiliated with a nonprofit, municipal government in any way, a professional in the design or engineering industry, please sign that letter. If you are an organizer, a community organizer, really invested in better buildings for our health and for our pockets, the MCAN advocates letter raises that particular messaging up front. So, and if you are both in whatever dual capacities you have, like Ellen and others on this call, I do urge you to sign both letters. The deadline for submitting comments to DOER related to the specialized stretch code, as Ellen mentioned, is Friday, March 18 by 5 p.m. And I also believe Lisa Cunningham dropped that information into the chat. I would like just to take a moment to see if folks have any questions. I know, for example, Candace has asked about the Attorney General's position and what are people's thoughts in terms of the AG's position undermining Lexington's great zoning incentive. What kind of justification does the AG's office provide for that? And Mark, do you want to come off of mute to respond to that? Mark Sandine?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. As I mentioned in the chat, Lexington and Cindy mentioned in her presentation, and Jesse mentioned in his presentation, that the Attorney General has approved a very similarly structured incentive zoning bylaw that Lexington just passed recently for the hybrid labs. But our hybrid lab bylaw is quite a bit different than what Brookline's recent bylaw is and the way it's been structured. So I don't think we can necessarily read anything into the Attorney General's ruling, but it is not the result we wanted to see. So we'll have to wait till June to know more about what happens.
Indeed. All right. Thank you, Mark, for fielding that question. Another question from Kim McCoy asks, have any of the authorities, AG's office and other entities opposing the gas bans, have they used the extremely high price of many recent heat pump bids to support their arguments? I don't have a clear answer to that. I am not sure about that. Mark, Lisa, or Jesse?
I can take that one. So not 100% sure what is being referred to here, but I think it is, and I'm not sure if they were relying on that information or not. What I can say is that it is overall more cost effective to do major construction projects that are all electric with heat pumps. And one of the reasons is, if you think about it, if you have a boiler or a furnace and an air conditioning system, you have two major systems that need to be maintained and eventually replaced. And when you just have a heat pump that does both, you have half the capital expenditure for your heating and cooling system oftentimes. So at least for the central equipment. So retrofitting buildings is a different story, and that's a much bigger challenge. And it's actually one of the reasons that it makes the most sense to do this during major construction projects when it's easy, because that is preferable by a long shot to having to retrofit an existing building, which is more expensive.
If I can add into that, Sarah, just from our experience looking at the construction of labs in Cambridge and Boston, they are luckily had to submit a lot of information to the city of Cambridge and the city of Boston about what they were expecting from these buildings, and their projections. It wasn't just a huge emissions reduction. The life cycle cost of savings of building this way was in the millions of dollars for these construction projects. So again, I just wanted to add that from the commercial lab side of things.
Mark.
And I'll add another perspective on this, which is Candace is rising prices. And the rising prices I'd suggest you think about are the rising prices of fossil fuels, which have just gone through the roof. And if you look at natural gas, National Grid raised their natural gas prices 14% on March 1st. We seen oil prices at $5 a gallon, and that for an average an average Massachusetts homeowner increases their price $1,000 a year in terms of how much they have to pay for heat. So we're in a situation right now where propane, oil, and natural gas are rising rapidly, and wind and solar are the same price as they always have been.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I just want to lift up a comment put in the chat by Michael Strauss, referring to the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, otherwise known as the BBRS. And this is the board that historically has promulgated and updated building code in the state. And he attended several meetings pre-pandemic at the BBRS, and he duly notes that it was clear several members are hostile to the idea of net zero buildings and a true net zero building code. And if folks remember, back in the Next Generation Roadmap bill signed by Governor Baker in March 2021, Governor Baker is required to appoint 3 new members to the BBRS, in addition to 1 representative from the Department of Energy Resources. It's important to note that the Department of Energy Resources is now the state entity responsible for developing a true net zero stretch code. In their language, they refer to as a specialized energy code. So Michael asks, how do we change who is on the BBRS and some of the other subcommittees that they have? And, you know, it's important to remember that one of the big advocacy pushes we can accelerate is demanding that Governor Baker appoint 3 new members to the BBRS, and that they have to have expertise. I offer in building science, energy efficiency, energy resiliency, and even energy justice. So that is a particular advocacy topic that MCAN has not forgotten about, but we really need to push on in addition to pushing DOER on a true net zero stretch code. Do any of the panelists have comments on that particular?
Yes.
Yes, Jesse.
I love that answer. I will add that it is not just the BBRS. You know, the legislature slapped the hand of the BBRS in that climate bill in several different ways, including by putting DOER in charge of the net zero stretch code. But we have an equally large problem at the Department of Public Utilities, where we have decision after decision after decision that is being handed to the fossil fuel industry. And so we need both a governor who understands the nature of the problem, which we do not have, but even a Democratic governor. We need to make sure the next Democratic governor understands the problem. And we also need to continue to push the legislature for change. So, for example, towns and cities have municipal electricity programs that are one of the best vehicles, policy vehicles for reducing emissions. But when you submit a new program, it has to be reviewed by the Department of Public Utilities, and they are taking on average 2 to 3 years to even respond. And so even to just get timely review, we need change.
Fantastic response, Jesse. I couldn't agree more. You know, in fact, the 2.5, 3 year wait was, yeah, I've heard about this challenge for the past 6 months from certain advocates in MCAN's orbit. So thank you for that reminder. That was fabulous. And Lisa Cunningham, I also noticed that you have a question. Do you want to ask your question to the folks from Lexington?
Well, it's not that important, but I was just wondering if your bylaw was in effect the way our bylaws actually went in effect in Brookline, to actually no fanfare, no objection, no press, no pickets outside of town hall. Our bylaws were happily in effect from September 2nd through February 25th. So, and we had projects going in front of our planning board that were under the regulations of our new bylaw, because that's the way zoning works. When you pass a zoning bylaw, they go into effect immediately pending the AG's decision. So I'm wondering if this has been happening in Lexington as well.
So yeah, my understanding, thank you, Lisa, for that question. Sorry, and Mark, I cut you off, but you can chime in too. My understanding that yes, that even our planning board has instructed one particular project that's underway, that this is something that they are going to have to meet. But as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, as soon as we pass this overwhelmingly, you know, all of the projects in play, or not quite yet in play, but we knew the property owners that were, you know, thinking about doing this, because everybody's jumping on the you know, biotech life science development bandwagon, if you will. They all were immediately, without a doubt, like no hesitation. Oh, we can meet that. We can probably exceed that. I mean, one even went as far as to say, well, we're going to look into see if we can do an all-electric lab building. So, and we know that there are firms and engineering firms and design firms that are really getting to there, even in our, you know, northern climate. So, yeah, so that it's underway, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. They're gonna, from what they say, they're gonna exceed it.
All right, thank you, Cindy. That was a great question. Do folks on the call have any other questions? We've sort of gone through all the questions in the chat. I realize we're 5 minutes over time, but we can certainly linger. I hope our panelists don't mind for a few more minutes if folks have any additional questions. And if you do, I invite you to come off mute or to drop your question in the chat. Marcia Hart, I see your hand is up. And you just need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. In the last couple of weeks, Senator Barrett said that the DOER has to fix the stretch code, has to fix the problem with the net zero stretch code. And then DOER 2 days later said in their meeting that the legislature hasn't made the correct law that's needed in order to fix the problem. So I was left wondering who is not doing what they're supposed to do. I tend to think that the legislature did a pretty good job, and that it may not be them, but I'm not sure about that anymore after what the head of the DOER said in the public meeting for Metro Boston and the North Shore. So who's the culprit, and what can you do to get them to, whoever's supposed to do the right thing?
That is a fantastic question. And I will just say that, you know, there remains some legal ambiguity about how to ban fossil fuels in a specialized stretch energy code. There's some ambiguity there. And that's something that one coalition is looking into. In terms of who's the culprit, I offer to reframe that in terms of where can we find a solution? And I think figuring out how we can get clarity on that legal ambiguity will give us insight into targeting who the culprit is. And they may be the same entity that we can exert pressure on. But either Ellen, yes.
I want to say, Marcia, I think you have an excellent question. However, I don't think we should try to answer it. I think it's essentially unanswerable. I think we should just say, how do we meet this goal? In all humility, this is one heck of a problem. It is really hard to get your head around it. And people who've been studying it for decades still don't know exactly how we're going to do it. So we just need to say very simply and repeatedly, how are we going to meet this goal? How are we going to get it done? Just tell us how to get it done. If anybody even approaches explaining, oh, we can do it this way, we will have a grown-up in the room, as Jesse mentioned. I don't mean to make that sound as disparaging as it just did, but we really just need to ask that question. We've got a goal, let's meet it. How do we do it?
If the governor was serious about solving this problem, this question would have been raised at the very beginning and not at the last minute, at the 11th hour. Legal question coming in now, this was passed a year ago. If the legislature is serious about solving this problem, they will pass this legislation that is in front of them now. And so while it is good to focus on progress and what we need to move forward, it is also important to understand the nature of the resistance that you're facing. And there is a lack of will at the state level that exists in the administration and exists in the legislature. And that is why it will be easier to ask the state to allow municipalities to act rather than to impose actions across the entire state. We will always be readier to act on the next climate action compared to the state. And that's why this is so important. And that will probably be true whether we're talking about the administration or whether we're talking about the legislature, because the political pressure that are on those institutions is different than the political pressure on our local communities. But our local communities, the ones that are most inclined to solve this problem, also have the most population and the most buildings and the most emissions. So we can make a big difference if they just let us lead.
Excellent. Thank you, Ellen and Jesse. And Lisa, your hand is up, and then Carolyn.
Thanks. I just wanted to, this isn't really a question. I just wanted to highlight that we, for the people on the call, that we have lots of resources. A lot of us on the panel tonight, or not us, a lot of people on the panel tonight, including some in the audience, are part of a building electrification accelerator program, and which is currently expanding to other towns and cities. And we have run a campaign of passing these home rule petitions. We have an incredible resource library. We have experts who are ready to advise. We have people who have done this in their own municipalities who are ready to advise and help other municipalities come forward. So I just wanted to offer that as a resource. I'll put my email in the chat again. I'll put Anne's email in the chat again. You're welcome to, we're both co-facilitators and co-founders of this BEA, and we're happy to speak with anybody and point them in the right direction if they want to start moving their community forward.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Lisa. And I can't say enough, you know, MCAN, we just recently joined the Building Electrification Acceleration team and the coalition, and it's just a fantastic group of super committed, so many of them are on this call tonight, super committed, passionate, experienced organizers.
And we're also, I also want to just, sorry, Sarah, just to say we're really thrilled to be working in partnership with MCAN. Sarah has done an amazing job, and thank you so much for hosting this incredible event tonight.
Oh, of course, Lisa, absolutely. And with that, Carolyn, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I just want to say another atta girl to Sarah and MCAN, but also have a question. In case people don't know, there are, I think, 6 people who are starting a hunger strike explicitly over the proposed peaking power plant proposed by the Mass Municipal Wholesale Electric Corporation in Peabody, along with the City of Peabody Municipal Light Plant Department. But I think they're, you know, they've certainly gotten some coverage locally, but I think it's, you know, sort of the next step of people who are desperate and don't know what else to do. So that's what they do. I mean, you can call it self-harm, you can call it, you know, a huge commitment, but it's awesome. And so, you know, look for coverage of that and what you think about it. My question is, as representing a smaller town that's kind of, you know, if I were to propose what you all did, I would get a lot of really, it would not be a 275-3 vote. And I don't, you know, people would say, well, who's doing that? You know, who are the, and we would say, oh, well, you know, Brookline, Cambridge, Arlington. Oh, well, yeah. So what do we say out in the boonies, whether it's, excuse me, you're not the boonies, Marcia, but Gloucester and Ipswich and some of the rest of us who are not in the immediate Boston area. do you have any advice for us on what to say to people who say, oh yeah, or yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I think there's a misperception actually, which is understandable, that Brookline, that somehow this was easy to pass in Brookline. And you heard Anne talk about all the steps that are required even in a place like Arlington. But in Brookline, when we started this, people did not think it would pass. People thought it was radical, poorly thought through, and premature. And we engaged with their concerns. And that's how we convinced them. And that's how we got the votes. So people brought their concerns. They said heat pumps don't work in cold weather. And we said, well, you know what? They're adopted more rapidly in Scandinavia than anywhere else in the world. And they said, this is going to slow down development. And we said, no, here's why it's not. So it was really that conversation. And I think that you can have that conversation anywhere, and you can have the conversation about economic justice anywhere. We have a gas utility that has to get shut down, and somebody's going to be left with the last gas connection. And that person, if they are not rescued by the state, their bills are going to be increasing over time as ratepayers leave the system. So we are going to have to get off gas.
I mean, I guess what I'd say is it is a serious consideration. A loss would not be great. So I think having kind of a vetting group at first to assess what might happen with a vote. I know in Worcester, Paul is here, they could not get a home rule petition filed or support on their city council. So they passed a non-binding resolution. Yeah, you have to take it in steps and figure out how you're going to win in the long run. Maybe you start with a non-binding resolution. Maybe you start with a zoning incentive bill. You have to analyze how to slowly educate and build the power. So I don't think it's. I mean, Arlington wasn't easy. It was a lot of work, but honestly, we have a very liberal town manager who's actually leaving. I don't know if you all have heard. Adam Chapdelaine is leaving. I know. Yeah. But I think there's some strategizing to do there.
I just want to add one quick comment. Sorry, Mark. All of us want to chime in on this question. So thanks to Jesse and to Anne, I totally agree with those remarks. I also want to say that in Brookline, the first major board to support us was our Brookline Housing Authority, representing our affordable housing arm of Brookline. They were the very first two boards to give us unanimous votes in Brookline. They stepped forward. That support was huge. And the reason why they stepped forward is they were actually already converting their buildings to 100% fossil fuel free buildings. And this wasn't just their major renovations. They were converting their old masonry buildings. They were giving their residents air conditioning as well as heating. They were producing cleaner buildings for their communities. So this is actually a social justice issue. This is an equity issue. Everybody should be afforded the right to live in clean, healthy, non-polluting buildings. Nobody should be left holding stranded assets. So this is actually an issue that goes right to the heart of environmental justice. Everybody should have this right. And so I think that's the way to frame things in your community, to start with the health issues. The fact is that developers are coming into these cities and towns and building these unhealthy buildings with high emissions, buildings that the residents are going to be left holding the bag for these stranded assets that people are building into their town. Stranded assets that they will have to remove at far, far greater costs. So this is an economic injustice. This is a equity injustice. And I think that this argument has to be reframed and turned on its head, because this is not an equitable thing, what's happening right now.
Well said, Lisa.
The,
Thank you.
the other
Oh,
thing
Mark.
the other thing I would say is I had the pleasure of going to Brookline while they were having these conversations. And they were conversations, they weren't arguments. They were facilitated discussions, and the concerns that people brought up were expressed as concerns, and the comments back were not arguments about why you're wrong. The arguments were, it was framed as solutions. So when somebody said, I have a concern, the facilitators of the thing said, we are looking for solutions. Does anybody have a solution? And what I saw as extraordinary is that the developers they got the developers in the room. They got the people who were most opposed in the room in this extraordinarily facilitated conversation where it was not an us versus them. It was a, we're all together in this, and here are solutions. Incredible work.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Mark. Very, very helpful. I did want to highlight Jane Wynn. You did have your hand up. Did you have a question?
It's a slight diversion. I think we have a real problem with not having designers and builders who are capable or who are willing to be doing a lot of this work. And we don't have plumbers, electricians, carpenters available. I mean, we've got a real problem with our that kind of chain to make all this work happen, even if we could get the building codes.
Yeah, so in case folks don't know, Jane is calling in from Western Mass. And, you know, I noticed you were also on the Ithaca call last night. I believe you were, Jane, or somebody from B was.
I think Rose was.
Rose was. And so I do want to share something that the folks on the Ithaca call mentioned last night, and that included the Director of Sustainability for the City of Ithaca, and two folks from Block Power, which is the community organizing and combination tech startup that is has contracted with Ithaca to do their 6,000 building decarbonization effort. And one of the pieces that they really emphasized, which Jane and her colleagues also emphasized in coalition calls that we are on together, is that we're talking about people when we're talking about building code, and not only the occupants, but the laborers. And the Block Power has set up what they call a green jobs corridor between, I think, New York City, sort of downstate and upstate. And they tap into state workforce development funds, and they pay people to be trained on the job. And I was thinking, Jane, actually, about our conversations related to workforce development, you and Jake's comments to MCAN. And I think this is when we're talking about building code, and I've said this in other places, building code is just one tool for decarbonizing our buildings. We need other tools that rest on this broader platform. And in many ways, the building code, the stretch energy code, the net zero stretch energy code is an economic engine if we frame it that way and we plan around it that way. And one of the planning tools could be, you know, thinking in some kind of parallel way, Jane, around, is there some kind of employment corridor or region or funneling system throughout the Commonwealth? Can we tap into either through local planning efforts or regional planning efforts? Some of the state workforce development funds, 12 million just went down from the climate bill to support workforce development. So I think there's additional work to do that prioritizes the workforce and the labor piece in these more rural municipalities where there frankly are not enough contractors and vendors. And there's a critical need for more of them and for additional training for those that are already in the professions. So I feel like that's not, you know, a clear actionable direction necessarily, but it provides, I hope, kind of a a broader framework for thinking about, we're not only talking about building codes, we're talking about an economic driver, that building codes, if it's hitched to other strategies, can propel us and accelerate us, reduce emissions, improve community health, improve our financial well-being, quite honestly, and just accelerate our clean energy economy overall. But we need to talk like that. We need to frame it like that, especially at town meetings. So that's my response to your question, Jane. Do other panelists have a comment or response to Jane's quandary?
I'll say one thing. Our local affordable housing development group has been building net zero buildings now for 6 or 7 years. And one of the things that they do is they tap into the local Minuteman vocational tech school for students who can help do this work. And so this is an interesting thing that municipalities can do, that anybody who's developing housing can do. They can tap into the schools that are training the next generation of contractors.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. That's wonderful. With that, I am going to draw our evening to a close. I really want to give a big thank you to all of the folks that presented and gave follow-up comments. So thank you, Jesse Gray and Lisa Cunningham from Bookline. Thank you, Cindy and Mark from Lexington, and a big shout out to Anne from Arlington, and a fabulous shout out to Ellen Watts for a really incisive, thoughtful summary and closing remarks. And thank you all for being on the call this evening. This is just the first step, the first conversation for a broader statewide movement for local leadership. And with that, I wish you all a very good evening. And I will
sign those letters.
Sign those letters.
Sign those letters. Thanks,
Namaste.
Mark.
Good night,
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks
Take
so
care,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks to all the speakers too.